Hello, everyone. On behalf of the IABC APAC board, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. Today, we're talking about trust. I'm Ross Monaghan. I'm half of the dynamic duo that is the professional development team for IABC APAC. My partner in crime for professional development is Melinda Coyne. How are you, Melinda?
Very good, Ross. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's going to be a great session today. Just quickly, for those of you that are new to IABC, we're a global network of communicators in diverse industries and disciplines, and we identify, share, and apply the world's best communication practices. IABC APAC has 12 chapters in 8 countries throughout the region, and we have an amazing group of leaders. I have to say that because they're our panelists today, but it is also very, very true. If you are not a member of IABC, it's a great time before you because IABC's membership month has been extended for a few days. So you've got about 7 days left to get a great discount on our international dues. If you are a member, I really encourage you to think about leadership in IABC because it really does lift your involvement in the industry. It lifts your networking. So I thoroughly encourage you to consider some leadership roles in IABC. If you do want to become a member, go to iabc.com or iabcapac.com. You'll find links there to how or to join up to become a member. So without further ado, on to today's webinar. I should say too that we'll have a backstage discussion after this. Most of you will have already received a link to that. We will send a link in the chat today so that if you just have misplaced that or you haven't seen the link, you can join us in an informal discussion about today's topic, which of course is trust. And when it comes to trust and research about trust, I think Edelman's Trust Barometer is synonymous with that, right, Melinda?
Yep, absolutely. Lots to talk about. So many things, we've seen the recent French-Australian relationship fractured over the perceived broken trust over the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal. We've got the COVID pandemic that's seen a wave of mistrust, nationalism and parochialism take root. And now we're facing the great resignation where people are asking themselves, what are my priorities and what's my purpose in my next career move? And brands are having to respond with purpose-driven leadership and vision and finding ways to be seen as trustworthy. So how do we build back trust? And what are governments, NGOs, and the media doing about it? There's a lot for our panelists to unpack. So let me introduce them as they represent various parts of the Asia-Pacific region. We've got Adrian Warr, CEO of Edelman in Southeast Asia. James Howe, Head of Corporate Affairs at Bupa Australia, also Chair of IABC Asia Pacific. Kazuko Kataki, Senior PR Consultant, Kyoto, also IABC Asia Pacific Membership Marketing Director based in Japan. Suniti Venugopal, Senior Director, Corporate Affairs at Walmart India Tech. And she's also Certification Director at IABC Asia Pacific based in India. And last but not least, Richard Abalida, President and COO of Aeon Stakeholder Relations Group, and he's also President of the IABC Philippines. So well-rounded panel. There's so much to discuss, Ross, isn't there? So where do we begin?
Yeah, well, so today's session, we're going to have a discussion from the IABC leaders and Adrian about what's happening on the ground. But Adrian, I think you're going to run us through some of the latest findings and some of the specifics of the latest research. Is that right?
I'd love to.
Take it away.
Let me just try and share my screen. I'll see if I can get this right first time. Are you able to see a lovely PowerPoint screen on deck?
We can.
On your screen. Marvelous.
Yep.
Worked first time. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Ross, IABC, for having me today. It's an absolute pleasure. Always a joy to be able to talk to this group and a privilege to have such a great group of people to discuss this with. We do this fabulous piece of research. It used to be an annual piece of research. We started it kind of 20 odd years ago because Richard Edelman wanted to try and quantify what it is we do for our clients, which is building trust. I don't know whether we've succeeded in quantifying it, but we've got a significant body of data to try and help us understand what drives trust. What was a annual survey is now something that we kind of carry on doing research throughout the year. So what I'm going to show you today is 3 chunks of trust research from 3 different studies that we've done this year. I'm not going to go through all the methodology or the boring stuff. As communicators, I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of that. Please feel free to ask me questions at the end if you want to about how we conduct the research. What I'd love to talk through today is 3 interesting highlights that we're seeing in trust, which I think are going to be super familiar to all of you working in communications. And I think they're just going to prompt an interesting discussion. The first is the new mandate for business. And by new, I mean, we've been talking about it for about 8 years, but people haven't necessarily embraced it yet. These things take time. So a mandate for business that is changing. The second thing I'm going to talk about is an infodemic. And then the third thing, which is going to lead on from that, is more about a solution in a way, which is the power of belief-driven employees and how we can tap into that to solve some of the challenges we've got around trust. So I'm going to kick straight in because I want to try and present only for about 20 minutes and then give time for lots of discussion. So business, new mandate. There's been a significant change over the last, let's say, 40 years, 50 years in the role of business in our lives. It was the case that business resided at the back of the newspaper in a business section, and the rest of the news was how we operated in society and what's going on. These days, business is inextricably linked to our everyday life, and it's front page news. It's just properly integrated into how we think about society. And that comes with opportunities and challenges. And we have seen around the world significant challenges in trust in government. This slide shows you trust in government around the world. It's a pretty blunt sort of snapshot of this. We ask the question, do you trust, brackets, government, NGOs, media to do the right thing? And this shows where the results are in each market. And you can see there's a bit of a trust deficit in government. We are questioning whether we believe and trust in our governments. Correlated perhaps to this, certainly no cause or effect, is actually businesses quite well trusted. Surprisingly, I think.
Well, can I interrupt, Adrian?
Yeah.
Your slides don't seem to be progressing. We're still stuck on slide 1.
Okay. Let me stop share and reshare.
You jinxed us by saying it worked first time.
I did. I can break almost any technology and from a great distance.
Is
that working?
Yeah,
that works. That works well.
Now we've
Thank you.
got the graph. Fantastic.
So we see trust in government is low. You can see all the reds there. The greys are neutral territory between 50 and 60%, and the blues are higher levels of trust. And you can see there's a fair few governments with decent levels of trust, but there's an awful lot over on the left-hand side with very low levels of trust in government. Correlated, although again I say it's not cause and effect, is a high level of trust in business, which may surprise some people here. We often, I think, feel, certainly in our roles, we feel a lot of the friction that business gets in terms of public disapproval, but actually levels of trust in business fairly high and increasing across a lot of markets, as you can see. But this is correlated with just a massive increase in expectations of the role that we believe businesses should play in society. This is Hong Kong data, but it maps pretty accurately in the 28 markets that we look at. 56% of people agree with the fact that a company can take specific action to both increase profits and improve the social and economic conditions of communities where it operates. So you can make money and be a successful business and get rich, but we also expect you to be good for the markets in which you operate, to provide a societal benefit. All good so far. However, I'm going to show you now 3 of my favorite statistics from trust, which are truly staggering. And the more you think about them, the more they kind of blow your mind. Businesses are increasingly expected to fill, I think you can say, a void left by government or perceived to be left by government. They certainly are expected to play now this very, very big role in fixing the issues that we're all upset about. 69% of people think CEOs should step in when the government does not fix societal problems. Sort of let it sink in a bit and think about that. So let's say we're in a market where we might have huge concerns about immigration. We're now expecting businesses to step in on that kind of thing. That's insane when you think about it. CEOs should take a lead on change rather than waiting for government to impose change on them. Again, think that through. No longer enough to comply with regulations. The expectation is you preempt regulations. And then 59% say CEOs should hold themselves accountable to the public and not just to the board of directors or shareholders. Again, quite mad. If you're a listed company, as we all know, you have one duty, and that is shareholder value. So there is, as you can see from these surprising statistics, a massive chasm between public expectation of what builds trust and actually the role that we traditionally have for business and the role that CEOs would have as their KPIs. So there is this huge expectation on business now to step in and fix societal issues. And it is, I think, to be fair to the businesses that we all work for, it is probably an unreasonable expectation. And businesses are having to try and catch up with that gap. Just a quick point on the kind of issues that we're expecting. 82% think that CEOs should publicly speak out, and these are some of the issues: pandemic impact, job automation, local community issues, etc. So it's not just on, say, the environment or gender equality, it's broader societal issues that we're expecting businesses to step out and talk about. And this statistic certainly would suggest that there are many people who think we are failing to do that our businesses are not yet living up to these expectations. So 53% of people agree with the statement that business leaders are purposefully trying to mislead by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. And those expectations shoot up to 61% for younger generations. Again, this is Hong Kong data, but this maps globally. So, rising expectations of business. Let's then look outside at a different context that we're operating in, and that's the infodemic. It's the fact that we have now this gigantic explosion of information sources around us, but huge confusion over what we trust and who we trust and where we get information from. We asked the question, what became more or less important to people over the last 12 months, looking at things that had changed during a pandemic. 61% said finding ways to combat fake news had grown more important for them. That statistic tends to trend fairly high each time we do the study. There is still this latent fear of news being deliberately used to misinform us. But two interesting things to the right-hand side of the slide here. First is a large number of people saying that it's more important for me now to increase my media and information literacy, and 46% saying it's more important for me to increase my science literacy. So a recognition that people are having to learn more in order to, in a more healthy way, navigate this complex ecosystem of information, which we're not sure we trust. And all of this happening at a time when media, traditional media, in the context of this question, is seen to be declining both in terms of ethics and competence. Put simply, we are not really sure who we trust. We're not really sure whether news sources are giving us the information that we want. 54% agree with the statement that journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. Not sure what the other 46% are thinking, because that's obviously true to a certain extent in certain areas of media. 60% of people saying most news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or a political position than with informing the public. And 68% say the media is not doing well at being objective and non-partisan. So a great deal of suspicion around traditional media. There are, by the way, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, a number of other statistics that show that there is an increasing importance in journalism and a greater respect for journalists. So there are two sides to this story. However, generally speaking, we are distrustful of traditional sources of information. And you can see here, again, Hong Kong data. We've got traditional media, search engines, own media, and social media all seeing a steady decline over this time period, and a significant drop in Hong Kong in the last couple of years. And while this is just Hong Kong data, I can tell you, for instance, 47% trust in traditional media. That's very high, actually. Across a great deal of, say, Western Europe and US, you'd see traditional media having much lower scores than that. And it's not just the sources, it's the people quoted. So it's our spokespeople as well. We're seeing a declining trust, steady declining trust for most of the different sources of information that we'd see quoted in papers as well. And here's the kicker. We are also part of the problem. Here in Hong Kong, fewer than 1 in 5 people have good information hygiene. Good information hygiene for this study, what we looked at is 4 different factors. Your news engagement, that's whether you are looking at multiple different news sources, trying to take in information from lots of different places instead of just 1, 2. avoiding echo chambers, i.e. trying to seek out news and information outside of just the bubble in which we live, verifying information and fact checking, and not amplifying unvetted information. People who are good on 3 or more of those factors, 16%. People who are moderate, so doing well on any 2 factors, 33%. 50% of people have poor information hygiene. They are doing 1 or fewer of those things, which is a concern. And 54% of people are sharing or forwarding news items. Only 16% of them have good information hygiene. So the remaining 38%, infodemic super spreaders, pumping out inaccurate information, which we are all, me included, lapping up and tending to believe. So we've got a huge problem of biased information, lack of trust information, and dissemination of false information. I think we all know this, but it's interesting to see it quantified. So big pressure on business to change their role in society. Big old mess over how we seek out information, who we trust, where we get our information, and all of us living in our own little echo chambers, digital echo chambers online. One of the interesting side factors in this is what's been happening between the employer and the employee, and the relationship of trust between the two. And there are positives and negatives to this. An interesting thing, we asked people, do you trust business, NGOs, government, and media? And you can see on the left-hand side the scores there. When we add in my employer as an option, comes out considerably higher. So the most trusted institution is the business that employs me, more so than my government, NGO, businesses, or media. Also, when we ask people what source of information they trust more, so if they see information more than once or twice from a source, would they trust it automatically? The highest, most trusted source of information is my employer. Very interesting when you think about how focused we've all had to be on communicating effectively around, say, COVID, or where we have had many markets around the world that have had significant civil unrest or government changeover. Again, the role of business and communicating internally around that, you can see here, is significant. And when you put that against our problem before of the infodemic, here's a solution. Employer to employee communications is trusted. It's accurate. It's usually unbiased, hopefully. So there is a good opportunity here for clarity of information for employers to focus on internal communications, not just for the purpose of business, but for the wellness of the entire society, I think. Also notable that from when we did a pre-pandemic study, January 2020, to the study that we did in May 2021, when we asked people what are the most important stakeholders for business in terms of defining their success, employees bumped up from 2nd to 1st in May. So they're now viewed by general population as the most important stakeholder for business success. And you can see there the trend of trust. The bottom line is our trust index. It's the average level of trust in the 4 institutions. The top line is trust in my employer. So you can see it's been for a while a much more trusted source of information and a much more trusted entity. But as we know, many, many months for all of us working at home, stress, burnout, homeschooling, all sorts of issues contributing to the Great Resignation. And we see here 20% of people planning to or are leaving their jobs in the last 6 months. And I would, just as a side note here, say we had a launch event where we had the CEO of Manpower, and their data was saying back in May, their data was saying it was around about 42% for them. 42% who were either planning to or had in the last or next 6 months leave their jobs. And you can see that cuts across all age groups as well. What do we want out of jobs? What are the problems? What are we seeking? Yes, career advancement. Yes, we want a paycheck, right? That's obviously fundamental and that obviously drives choices. But the 2 biggest factors that companies can work with outside of simply remuneration are personal empowerment and social impact. We want companies that make us feel part of decision-making, that make us feel involved in the running of the business. And we want companies that are going to have a social impact, that have a purpose, that are there, yes, to make money, but to do something good while making money. 61% are now making choices on jobs based on beliefs. And those are some of the beliefs you can see on the screen there. That's a significant number. Again, a little sort of side dialogue on this. This is not saying that 61% of people are going to leave your company. And we are not seeing people vote with their feet yet. But this is probably your canary in the coal mine warning you of people's intentions. And I do think that that statistic is going to increase. So belief-driven employees, very much a thing. And not just a Western woke millennial thing. We're crossing age groups there. Yes, definitely favors towards the 18 to 34 group, but even at 55 plus, we see 49% of people likely to choose jobs on belief. Now, there are challenges with this. If we think through the implications, say, for instance, for employee activism, there are some big implications there. When we ask people whether they agree with the statement, a large group of employees exerting strong pressure within our organization can get it to change almost anything about itself, or to agree with the statement, cannot force our organization to change anything that the organization itself does not want to change, 50% of people now believe they can force the company to change, which is probably a very good thing. You can see that breaks out differently across these markets, 66% in China, 38% in Japan. And for anyone that has worked in Japan, I think you'd appreciate that that's a fairly significant statistic for a Japanese working culture. So a lot of people feeling that they are empowered to drive change within their business, which is great. 76%, I will take action to produce or motivate urgently necessary changes within my organization. But there's always a but. 58% will work within a system, i.e., they will petition senior management. They'll suggest changes to their direct manager or HR. They'll send internal communications to senior management. 40% will work outside of the system. They will take it public. They will be more aggressive activists. They'll whistleblow, they'll go on strike, they'll leak internal documents, they'd be willing to do social media campaigns or even set up physical protests. Again, I don't think most companies are seeing 40% of their people doing this, but this is a stark warning. This is saying that employees are willing to take action. And I think, you know, a big takeout for this needs to be that companies should absolutely lean into employee activism. Even if it makes us uncomfortable, we should embrace employee activism and create a good system for it. Because if we don't have a good system for it, people are going to take it public. 1 in 3 say they've left their job because their employer failed to take a stand on issues. Again, interesting splits that show it's not just about one market or not just about one generation or indeed gender. This statistic represents a feeling across most sections of society that we survey. There is an advantage, of course. For employers that take a stand on issues, there is a bump of people that are likely to stay or join your company, and the types of issues that are important to people: healthcare access, human rights, economic inequality, gender equality, climate change, COVID, racism, etc. The list goes on. But for all of them, you can see a significant boost in the likelihood of whether people would want to work for a company or not based on their stand on these issues. And step back from the impact for business. Here's an interesting correlation, just winding up to my last conclusions. This opportunity of building better trust between employer and employee has a knock-on effect. Not cause or effect, but a correlation here, very clear correlation between levels of trust in employer and general levels of trust in institutions. If we operate on an assumption that higher levels of trust in a country is probably a good thing, then you could argue that higher levels of trust with employees to employers is going to have a net positive impact on levels of trust within that society or market. So it's good for the world as well as good for business to build employer trust. I want to leave lots of time for questions, so I'm just going to wrap up with the conclusions from those points. We've seen this rising expectation of businesses' role in society. We've seen massive confusion and distrust over the plurality of information sources that we have and whether we should trust them or not. And we're seeing a huge change and significant increase in importance of the level of trust between employees and employers, and a greater willingness of employees to be activists based on their being belief-driven. So what do we do? Well, the statistics are very clear. Business needs to welcome and embrace the call for them to take a stand. We've heard it from consumers. 64% of consumers agree that they would choose, switch, or avoid or boycott a brand based on its stand on societal issues. So there is consumer demand for a high level of business purpose. We've got belief-driven employees. I've just described to you as 61% saying that they are choosing companies based on values and benefits. And when we did a US investor study, we also found that 92% of investors agree that business leaders have an obligation to use their power and influence to advocate for positive change in society. So you've got consumers, employees, and investors all saying, get a purpose, contribute to society. The call is very, very, very clear. So embrace that expanded mandate. Match your words with action. Have a purpose and take action on it. And start with employees. That's my brief presentation for today, and hopefully food for thought for the rest of the panel. And I will now take my screen down and hand over to you, Ross.
Thanks, Adrian. Well, one of IABC's strengths is our global reach, and we're going to use that to full effect now. We've got some panelists from right around the region. I'm going to start off with James Howe, who's the chair of IABC APAC. James, what issues did this bring up for you, and what are you seeing on the ground in Australia, because you're based in Melbourne?
I am indeed. Thanks, Ross, and good afternoon, everyone. Look, Adrian, wonderful presentation. As always with that data, so many strings that you can pull out of it. I think one thing, and I know it was noted in one of the comments in the chat by Melanie Gibbons, we're certainly seeing that role of CEOs starting to take a lead on societal issues, whether it be climate change going on at the moment, things like vaccination policy in terms of encouraging people for the uptake of vaccines and highlighting the benefits that was going to deliver, through to gender equality, violence against women, etc. Stepping out, making statements on those sorts of things. I think where it's been key though, and in the cases of where it goes well versus where it falls over, is the part that you mentioned there right at the end, Adrian. You've got to make sure that the substance is there inside, that it's actually not just a marketer or a communicator coming up and saying, this is the right thing that we should be saying. It's actually, is the company as a whole, this is the right thing for us to be doing, and we are actually doing it. And I think until you've got those doings in place to start with, you don't have the right to be able to go out and talk about it, because in this connected world now, whether it be your people internally or your customers, etc., they will see what you've done, they'll know how you've acted, and they will put it on Twitter or in the media or wherever it might be. So getting that balance right, I think it's absolutely playing out here in Australia. More and more, there is the expectation that people will lead, that business and CEOs will lead, but very much that they've got to have their own house in order first before they start lecturing to others. I think the other thing, and I'll wrap up knowing we've got a very talented panel to get through, in terms of throughout the pandemic and that importance of employees trusting their employers as the source of information. I've certainly seen a lot of that firsthand, and I think a part of it was the ability for companies to be able to take all of the various sources of information and disseminate it down into one clearer, easier to understand message. So it made it easier for employees to be able to understand everything that was going on, what's relevant to me, what do I need to know to be able to get my life back to normal.
Thanks, James. I think let's go to Sunita. What are you seeing on the ground in India?
Yeah, Ross, thank you so much. James, Adrian, it's the same sentiment out here, because most of the organizations in India are on purely talent play, just like how Walmart, where I work, is. We don't have business here, but it's more about making sure that we are able to attract and retain good talent. And what I have seen is, to the contrary, is people trusting organizations where they've not even gone or stepped into their office, but they're willing to kind of, go and give their best to the organization. And it's the same where we are hiring so many people during the pandemic, and the trust that, hey, you know what, this is a place that I want to work because of the culture, value, and belief. Just on the paucity of time, Ross, just one bit that I want to leave is, if we were to look at, things around us, there is a huge role that communicators play in terms of building trust as a manager, as an employee, as a parent, as people around us, and what is it that we are learning and how do we kind of articulate and give back. I think trust deficit is something that, it leaves a huge gap in whatever communication that you want to build. So, working really with the managers in the organization or working with the leadership and like really being very transparent out there on what is working, what is not working, and employees get it. I think that's what I'm seeing here in India.
Mm. Some great insights there, and happy Diwali, by the way, Sunita, and for all of our guests joining us from India. Over to the Philippines, Richard.
Hey, hi Ross, and thank you for having me today. So aside from being the Vice President of IABC Philippines, the other hat that I wear is as President and COO of Eon, and that's why I know Adrian very well. We are Edelman's affiliate in the Philippines, and for many years we have also taken inspiration from Edelman's Trust Barometer with our own Philippine Trust Index, which we run every 2 years. So we will be releasing the full results of the PTI next month, and we are completing the data processing at the moment. But we've already taken a preliminary look at the data because I was rushing to have some information ready for this webinar. So we took a look at the data, and I'm happy to share some insights in the market. So some context first. When Edelman released the Trust Barometer in 2017, we saw different results in the Philippines. We saw trust rising despite global uncertainty, and we attribute that largely to the fact that we were coming at the heels of a new presidency. At that time, President Duterte was elected in 2016 and was still, really riding high. Then in 2019, we saw trust levels decline, reflecting a delayed erosion of trust in the key institutions that both Edelman and Eon track in the Philippines. But we still saw a high trust rating for the government, driven by the Office of the President, which I know has baffled the rest of the world. But Duterte continues to have really high ratings in the Philippines. So this 2021, we took a look at how the global pandemic impacted trust on Philippine institutions. And what we saw is that leadership and actions taken by the different institutions have changed the public's perception of the trustworthiness of these institutions. They saw that organizational leadership and agility as the biggest factors behind the change in perception of trust. So at this time of crisis, while the church, the academe, media, NGOs, and government were still able to gain or maintain the public's trust, business flipping the Edelman's data became the biggest loser. But I'd like to highlight that it's still high at the mid-60s, but it reflects a drop in perception and has not stepped up as much as the other institutions. So the two most trusted institutions in the Philippines currently, based on the data, are the church and the academe. The strong presence and high visibility of their leaders and the agility of their organizations ensured continuity of their services even during the most stringent of lockdowns. I think next to Melbourne, or even more than Australia, the Philippines has had the longest continuous lockdown in the world. Trust perceptions for media and NGOs significantly improved compared to our last reading 2 years ago, owing to the presence and visibility on the ground during the most challenging days of the pandemic. And government remained on a steady state, which can be attributed, of course, to the multi-layered organizational structure where we have the national government, but we also have local governments picking up the slack when on the ground when the national government isn't as fast and as agile. So business as a whole was the biggest loser over the past 2 years, dropping 5 percentage points as the sector struggled with, of course, just like the rest of the world, with business continuity and preserving jobs. And what we saw in the data for this year, the drivers of trust, Filipinos in general, but more so during the pandemic, have demonstrated a penchant for the tangible. So, for example, for media, the driver of trust for media is their presence on the ground during the pandemic and calamities. For NGOs, it's about offering real programs to help the poor. For government, it's helping the poor address their basic needs. And for business, the biggest driver for trust, which probably reflects why there was a drop, is fair labor practices and good salaries and benefits. And of course, as businesses struggled with cash flows, revenue during the pandemic and the lockdowns, it appears that employees and the public in general are not seeing business as a sector as favorably as before. So maybe in closing, I think it's important for developing markets like the Philippines, where low income populations that we get to see and feel more tangible trust drivers to boost a company or a sector's numbers. That's it from me.
Thanks, Richard. Some great insights there. And our final panelist, Kazuko, and of course, Japan's had some, not only the pandemic, the Olympics, so the eyes of the world have been on you. Over to you for your thoughts.
Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm Kazuko. I'm a membership director at IABC APAC and also marketing VP at IABC Japan. And yeah, as Adrian said, Japan has usually tend to have lower grade, usually 20% lower than many almost all questions. And so as the sentiment for maybe employee activism, I think it will take some time for Japanese audience, for Japanese employees to take the word, take an action or take a strong action and use the word activism. But I do see the certain pattern, the same pattern, because I see, people are moving, leaving employee or going to another brand for, belief. So that is happening here, even though the sentiment is lower. And I do think, the distrust on media, but also the trust or value on journalism is also true in Japan. And when it comes to Olympics, we were cautious and suspicious about whether it's going to be okay to have an Olympics, but without having in audience in the studio, we did it. And the Japanese sentiment, our national sentiment also turned, from negative to positive. We are yeah, we made it, finally. So that was good. So I think that media has played a good role in there, although there are some pros and cons, during and even after. But overall, it was good. And when it comes to the government, the trust on government is low, low in Japan. The House of Representatives election voting rate was slightly over 50%, so which is quite low for the that level of election. So there is a distrust on government, but we will have to fix it. And when it comes to the employer trust, our belief, my belief in the public relations practice at Kyoto is face-to-face communications, which is very much close to employer relations, not only the public relations or media relations. So trusting someone close to you, someone who look after you, is the key of the trust, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Kazuko. So Melinda, I think we've got some questions, some great questions from the audience. Oh, you're on mute.
Look, someone has to do it, don't they?
It wouldn't be a Zoom session without saying that, would it?
I wish I'd prepared that, but there we have it, folks. Look, great questions, and please, anyone, please keep bringing them in. So, Kirsten, I'm not sure if we've answered this. Would be interested in community trust in data privacy during the pandemic. People seem willing to share if it benefits their physical and emotional health.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I was thinking about it when I saw that pop up just now. The short answer is we haven't really got great data to empirically say. What we have in our trust barometer on data privacy, we saw around about 7 years ago, it just crashed up the agenda and just became a massively important thing for trust for all businesses. And indeed, it was so far ahead of everything else for 1 year in trust that it sort of became the lead story, that it was all about protect my data. It's remained important, but I think the human brain only has the capability to keep lots of things important at the same time. And so it's sort of dropped down the ranking in terms of other things now being prioritized. But I think when you ask people, prompted in a list, they now naturally putting other things on top of it because we talk about other things more. We talk about things like burnout, we talk about all sorts of other stuff. So the issues of the day tend to overtake. Statistically, it has not dropped to something that's super important. As for whether the willingness for people to share data, we do have a COVID study of trust that we did back in January, and it did show different levels of trust in different concerns in markets about levels of trust in governments and handing over data to governments, or of doing contact tracing apps. And it's very interesting data, but it's just as you would probably expect. It's a completely different story for different types of people in different markets. You have a huge division. So the data tends to come middle of the ground when you look at the top line stat. You then put it apart, you see it's huge polarized views of some people that think it's great and I'm going to give all my data and we need to solve the pandemic, and some people saying I'm not giving anyone my data. And that doesn't necessarily split just by age. It doesn't necessarily, in the US, for instance, it didn't necessarily split by Democrat, Republican, and things like that. It's not quite as we've seen. There are some people that are worried about it and some people that are not. There are some interesting standouts. As you can imagine, the results in Hong Kong were quite different from elsewhere on that. People are very reluctant here to hand over data for other contextual reasons, I think. And in the US, obviously, there was a huge section of the survey that was very, very reluctant on it. But I haven't really got a very clear story on how that's changed now. That was the one-off study of where we were in May. I think when we keep doing studies this year and do another COVID run, probably towards the end of the year, as we start getting trend data, we might know more on it.
It's interesting. Thanks, Adrian. Sorry, James, please jump in. I was about to throw
two things just to add on that. I think in terms of trust around data security on a whole, now not sort of COVID specific, but it's got to the point where I think there's almost an expectation now that people know in handing over their data, they expect that there will be a data breach at some point. Where the trust comes into it is how companies respond to that. What do they do when there is a data breach? How do they keep you informed? What steps do they take? What do they do to remediate? So I think that's a really important thing to note in sort of data breaches in particular. On the COVID one, certainly an issue that arose here in Australia was the use of check-in data for police to access in terms of using it then for investigating crimes and the like. Now, there was an attempt made for it to be done. The government here actually stopped that and said, no, that is not for the use of it. So it was interesting there just in terms of, I think if that had been allowed, that may have undermined some of that trust in the system as a whole. But yeah, certainly an interesting one how that played out.
I think you make a really good point, James, actually, about how companies respond to those data breaches. That's really what counts. It also goes to the question of ethics too, which is something that IABC certainly has a huge consideration around. Any other panelists want to respond to that question? Otherwise, I would love to read out the others, but let me stop for a minute just to check in. Okay, so we've got a question from Christine, which is really about, even though these results are sort of Hong Kong figures, can we extrapolate them out across other regions like Australia?
Yeah, so I've deliberately chosen slides, even though some of them were from Hong Kong. Some of the earlier slides with the little red flag at the bottom were from Hong Kong, but I deliberately chose slides that would be representative of trends that are not ubiquitous, but certainly dominate most markets. So there are obviously standouts. You have different statistics in different markets depending on what's going on there. So for instance, data privacy would be very, very different if you're surveying our Chinese population versus our UK population. We're naturally going to get those kind of different views. But the trends tend to stay similar. And another point that I should have made early on, but I didn't, because I think you probably all get this. Obviously, comparing country to country is a mug's game. There's no point in looking at the results in Japan and comparing them to the results in the US and therefore making extrapolations about the differences in those countries. That you can't do it. Even just the nuances of how you translate the word trust has subtly different meanings in each language. So you can't compare market to market in that way. But certainly within markets, even if you see, for instance, Japan on 38% of people being willing to engage in employee advocacy versus 66% in China, doesn't necessarily mean it's that different. It can just be the nature of how people respond to surveys. So when we put it on screen, it's because we think it is a statistically significant or relevant trend for that market, even if the stats seem to be slightly different. So generally speaking, most of the trends I've shown you there would be applicable across most markets. When you dig into the interesting detail, and so for instance, if you're looking at employee activism and what people would be activist about, environment versus gender, then you get some really big differences in markets, really big differences. And those I don't think you can categorize. It all goes down to local nuance, which is why, in all honesty, the survey is absolutely fantastic for looking at the big picture and looking at over many years. When you want to actually understand what's going on, say in Australia, you have to take the data and then go and talk to a bunch of experts in Australia who help you interpret it. So it's sort of directional rather than diagnostic.
No, thank you. It's very interesting. I was picked up on the story around the mistrust of journalism. And I just saw something recently where they were talking about that more broadly, say in China, where there's a bigger push, where there was a sense that domestic journalists are trusted far more than people sort of reporting internationally and foreign journalists. So not a homogenous view, as you say. You've really got to sort of treat various regions differently.
That's an interesting one where you get very different reactions across different markets depending on the role that media plays in those markets. And it's really interesting. I love presenting this in Asia Pacific because people tend to get this more. When I would present this back in Europe or the US, you have to explain quite a lot of significant things. There is a popular misconception in how people talk about this media debate that you have free media in the West and state media in China, etc. Big misconceptions really in just comparing those two things, and that the media just plays different roles in society. And a massive misconception that we have free media. We don't. We have commercial media.
Yes.
Right,
yes,
we have media that is designed to get clicks and get eyeballs. It is not, as we've seen from the data, designed to be telling us the truth. Whereas if you're in China, you are getting a very different style of journalism that is probably as accurate, if not more accurate, than a lot of the stuff that we're consuming. So media definitely in crisis and reactions to it in crisis, and it is interesting. But there's a lot of statistics behind the scenes over the last 3 or 4 years that do show that we have, after a love affair with social media and search, you're seeing a decline in trust around social and search pretty dramatically. And with that, we're actually seeing signs of a return to trust to aspects of journalism. The issue that we've got in markets where we have commercial media is that we trust journalists, but we don't trust media institutions. So we trust the idea of journalism, people that research things, people that can be sued, people that try and go and find the truth. We don't trust the commercial enterprise behind it that's designed to get our dollars. And that kind of makes sense.
Sure does. Yeah, look, that's a topic that's close to my heart. I'm particularly fascinated by it. Anyone else want to make a comment on that? No?
I totally agree. Yep. When it comes to the big directional meanings against versus countries by country or country comparison and making diagnostics.
Thanks very much, Kazuko. We sorry, Sunita, did you want to say something?
If I can just add, Walmart being a huge organization, and we have like close to about 2.2 million associates working across the world. When we look at our own data of how we capture the associate engagement survey, and we see like there's so much of different viewpoints when the same associate takes a survey in the US and where the same associate takes survey here in India, and then we further see that a survey that's taken in North India to the survey which is taken in South India is very, very different, because culturally people are really looking at trusting whom they report to, and then sometimes the organization. So there is a lot of difference in the gaps that we are seeing.
I think as well, bringing up Adrian's slide in terms of the importance of people to have media literacy. I do wonder if a part of the component in terms of dealing with trust of media or media trust is I trust the media that aligns with my views, but if there is a story that has a different view to mine, then that's fake news. And I think it's really important how that plays out, because even today I saw again on Twitter a journalist I follow who has probably been branded as pro right side of government here, getting attacked by a right side of government voter for going after a right side of government politician, conservative politician. Despite them, for months had been copying the same sort of slack going the other way. So
yeah,
I think part of it almost becomes a bit of a cop out to say, oh, we don't trust the media, as opposed to how much of that is I don't like it when it doesn't reflect my view.
I love what you're saying there, James. And I tell you what, I totally agree. And there's another bit which we can't prove in this study because you can't research people's subconscious habits, but there is a correlation, let's put it that way. And I have a theory that I would love to prove. If there's anyone smart enough to tell me a methodology for how we can prove this, then please do. There seems to be a link as well in terms of people's sense of control of how they're sourcing it. If I Google something and find a result, it almost seems to matter less whether it's the FT or InfoWars. The act of having searched for it for myself and the control of sourcing it increases a level of trust. If I get information via friends and family and social, I trust it more than if I see it on a bus. So there is this huge, weird importance that we place on the person that's giving it to me, which can completely change your level of trust that you might have had in the masthead before. And we also trust things that we find through Google that we wouldn't necessarily trust if they were just put in front of us. So there's loads of weird nuances going on that make it impossible from our data to say people trust traditional media or people trust the FT or people trust, it's just so nuanced, as you say, that it's really hard now to pin down what people do actually trust. And the answer seems to be what I'm getting through search and social off my friends and family.
Which is you do sort of question, do we have the skills to sort of test the veracity of information, do that kind of basic fact checking? I guess, my little plug is I've always thought that a basic arts degree, which helps you kind of think about thinking as opposed to, teach a particular thing. But that kind of meta-analysis, I think, is really missing. Can I just throw it to another really comment, and also Vanessa's got a follow-up question. Vanessa's asked or made a comment, traditional media owners are often significant business leaders. How does this view of traditional media intersect with the desire to believe in business leaders? Specifically, does the panel have a view on the Murdoch media empire, which has moved 180 degrees on its position in climate change? Then she's asked a follow-up question. What are the top 3 things that we can do to improve information hygiene? Adrian, that information hygiene might be one for you.
Yeah. I'm happy to go on that. I'll probably better keep my personal opinions on Murdoch Empire to myself, but
well, to help you there, we're at the quick fire answer part of our webinar with only 4 minutes left, Adrian. So that's
okay. Well, look, I mean, I would say yes, it's absolutely inextricably linked. Yes, we have negative conceptions about CEOs, and watch Succession to see what the popular view of big media owners is, right? I mean, they absolutely now form the bad guy stereotype in media. So yeah, I think there is a type.
They do. And also, just to plug everyone, we are going backstage so we can sort of chew the fat a bit more on some of these very meaty and rich issues.
Absolutely. And if you didn't get the email, there is a link that I put in the chat not so long ago as well. But that's pretty much it for today's session. We're almost out of time. It's been a fascinating session. I've just taken a screen grab of Adrian's last slides where he talks about embracing the expanded mandate, looking towards purpose-led action and starting with employees. But there was just so much great information from Adrian, Kazuko, Sunita, Richard and James. So thank you to all of the panelists. And thank you for everyone who took part in today's session and made such great questions and comments. This really is the power of IABC. We are stronger together. We have global reach. We are a group of communicators that love sharing insights with each other and helping each other out. If you're not a member, I strongly recommend that you investigate membership. It is a great organization. And one final thing, just want to plug some of the upcoming webinars. If you haven't thought about applying for a gold quill for some of the work that you have done, I thoroughly recommend that you go through that process. The gold quills are the preeminent awards for business communicators throughout the world. Having a gold quill on your shelf, as I know many of the people in this webinar have, says a lot about you. And if the Great Resignation is personal to you, it's going to be great to have on your CV as well. So have a look at that. And we've got a couple of great webinars coming up about winning the Gold Quill Games. So go to IABCAPAC.com to check out when they are. And Melinda and I, and particularly Melinda, has put a lot of work into it, a great upcoming webinar, which is on the 26th of November. We're looking at creativity. Why does it matter? And it's going to be a great session, isn't it, Melinda? We've been talking to artists, tech people.
Yep.
I'm just can't tell you how excited I am about it.
Yeah. Please come and join us. We're going to talk about the metaverse. We're going to talk about skills. Can you learn creativity? Is it a competitive advantage? It's going to be a great conversation, very similar format. And yeah, please come and join us. And this is why it pays to kind of be part of it.
Absolutely. Well, look, it's spot on 4 p.m. here in Australia. I know it's not 4 o'clock where most of you are, but we'll start the Zoom backstage. I hope to see you then again. Kazuka, Sunita, Adrian, Richard, James, of course, Melinda, thank you for your time today. We'll see you at our next webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks, everyone.